about 6 inches, I think, about 6 inches. So I think oftentimes when we think about what makes something a Jewish conversation, we think about what Jewish ideas or Jewish experiences animate it. And I know that John Wutcher, alav hashalom, of blessed memory, he stood for education as a journey to identity. Education was a way to help people find their Jewish identity. And so what I'd like to do for the next very short while is I'd like to ask some questions about the hyphenated American Jewish identity that come directly from Jewish texts. What makes this a Jewish conversation is actually not that I'm going to be quoting from rabbinic texts. What makes this a Jewish conversation is that it implicates Jews. What makes this a Jewish conversation is that we live and exist in a world and need to think about how we engage with it. But I want to deepen our conversation by bringing our Jewish texts to bear, by bringing the classical canon to bear. And when I bring the classical canon to bear, I want to make very clear that I'm not actually looking for answers. I'm looking for questions. And the only thing I can do in the next 15 minutes with you is raise a number of questions about the hyphenated American Jewish identity that is posed by a rabbinic aphorism, by a rabbinic ruling known as Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the kingdom is the law. We're not going to find a linear 1-to-1 ratio of something that's talking about the law of a kingdom to living in the democratic United States of America. And that's not what we're looking for. But Dina de Malchuta Dina, as hopefully we will see in the next few minutes, invites us to ask important questions of how a Jewish people and how Judaism, with its own ideas, norms, aspirations, and internal politics, exists within a broader world of norms, ideas, politics. We're going to ask 4 questions. The first question we're going to ask is why? Why do the rabbis consider it significant to spend a line in 4 different places in the Talmud explaining to us that the law of the land is the law? What's motivating that ruling? The second is who. Who does this concept of Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law, I'm going to say, of the land is the law, who does it think Jews are in the countries in which they live, in their host countries? Does it imagine them as outsiders? Does it imagine them as insiders? Does it imagine them as both? The third question we're going to ask is to what extent? To what extent is this Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law, actually implicating us in a deeper conversation about democratic values as opposed to a mere performance of civic duties when we are told this is the law and this is what you follow? How inspired can we be by the ideas and the ideals of this democracy when thinking through the lens of Dina de Malchuta Dina? And my fourth question is going to be what? Well, what counts? What is it that the law of the land has to be? What are the contours? What are the criteria that it has to meet in order to be worthy of Samuel in the Talmud saying, we need to be following this? And so I'm going to give you 5 minutes, a whole 5 minutes, to read a very short excerpt, one of the 4, from the Babylonian Talmud, probably cited, authored, said sometime around the late 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century, so a while ago. You have this in your day-long schedules. There's a little insert. You also have it up there. I'm going to invite you for 5 minutes with the person next to you to read this and to ask yourselves the question of why. Now, I need to make something clear. This text is about taxes. This conversation is not about taxes. I'm going to say that 2 more times over the course of the next 12 minutes. This conversation is not about taxes. The background is asking the question of whether the taxes that a king collects are considered stolen money. I leave you for 5 minutes and we will reconvene, asking the question of why. What is motivating this conversation? The best. Just a 2-minute warning. What'd you say? Oh, yes. You want me to finish by 2 o'clock, correct? Intense. We're doing it. We're doing it. We're doing it. Yeah. Okay, the Mishnah states, one may not change from the purse of tax collectors because the taxes they have collected are considered stolen money. That is to say, the taxes that the government, in this particular situation, this is not about taxes. The taxes that the government collects, considered stolen money. And the Gemara, the Talmud says, V'ha'amar Shmuel, what about Samuel's statement, Dina de Malchuta Dina, that the law of the kingdom is the law. That is to say, it is binding. It is binding on Jews to follow the law of the land.
Amar Rav Chanina bar Kahana, Amar Shmuel. So Rav Chanina, son of Kahana, said in the name of Samuel, B'moches she'ein lo kitzva. This must be talking about a tax collector who collects any amount he wishes at any point. In other words, there is no fair standard that he is actually following. Dibei Rabbi Yanai Amrei, and from the house of Rabbi Yanai they said, B'moches ha'omed me'elav. It's someone who doesn't represent government, but somebody who's going around taxing people. The why. What's motivating Samuel? What's motivating Shmuel when he says, Dina de malchuta Dina, the law of the land is law? There are many explanations offered. The two dominant ones stand at odds with each other. The first, transactional Jewish interests. That is to say, the king is in charge, the government is in charge. If you don't listen to them, who knows what may become of you? And then the opposite reading. Jews, just like anyone else, are part of the social contract that allows all of this to be happening. Jews are part of the larger fabric. So we look at these two side by side, and we actually see different parts of the Jewish people in North America embodied by these two approaches. And sometimes the complexity of both approaches being felt at once. And we ask the question, who do we think we are in America? And the question is not easily answered. And Dina de Malchuta Dina doesn't answer the question, it brings up the question. A further question that it brings up, in addition to, are we a minority looking out for our own interests primarily, threatened by what might happen to us here? Or are we part of the actual fabric of citizenship and what it means to be an American today, is complicated by another question. What happens when it is Jews themselves who are making, writing, upholding, protecting those Dina de Malchuta, those laws of the land? We are in the highest offices in the land. The highest offices in the land, writing as Americans, thinking as Americans, developing democracy as Americans. How does that complicate the conversation? And so the why and the who are very much intertwined with each other. To what extent? This is a really important question that we don't like to admit is actually a question. To what extent does the idea of Jews living in a place where we benefit, living by the rules because the rules are kind to us, because of Jewish exceptionalism, to what degree does that obligate us to think about, as Tamara said this morning, the origin story of those rules? To be part of the ideology, to bring that ideology into our thinking, not only for its benefits, but for its obligations. To what extent is that possible? And the reason I ask this is because I think there's another question sitting underneath it, which is, what's the relationship between the Jewish norms, values, rules, ideas, and the broader culture's norms, values, rules, ideas? Do we have a fear, and I don't think it is an unfounded fear, that in the elision of these two, we may lose the particular Jewishness, whether in terms of interests, of protecting a unique Jewish community, or values, of maintaining some sort of distinctiveness. And the classical commentators express this with questions like, wait, just want to make sure that Dina de Malchuta Dina doesn't apply in personal status cases that we handle on our own in our Jewish courts. Or the question of, there is such a thing as Jewish civil law. What happens when Jewish civil law and, I'm going to say, American civil law don't actually mesh with each other? Who are we preferring? Is this a case in which we are saying we are bringing the Dina de Malchuta, we are bringing what is around us into a Jewish framework? Or is this a worry that we are going to lose our Jewish framework by being overwhelmed by the culture and Dina de Malchuta Dina around us? And that is a live question for many, many Jewish educators, and something that we have to think about. To what extent? And my last question is a simple what. You may have noticed, as you were studying, that not every din, not every law qualifies. In fact, we saw a very interesting example of almost, I wouldn't say democracy, but equality before the law at work in this Talmudic passage. We start with, well, the tax collectors, this is not about taxes, the tax collectors must be thieves only in a case where they are not actually obliged by any standard of law, when there's actually no due process of what's happening. And what's fascinating is to see the way that medieval Jewish commentators said, what is this criterion about? So Maimonides says the criterion is about a way of discriminating against particular people, particular groups. Other medievalists say, why don't you notice it's Dina de Malchuta? It's the law of the kingdom, not Dina de Malka, not the law of this particular king, whatever he chooses to come up with. And so the fourth question that we're left with, beyond the questions of identities within our society, and beyond the question of how much of this is a performance and an obligation to norms, and how much of this is actually an imbibing of real ideas and ideology, and how do we maintain our distinctiveness within that. But we're left with a final question. The final question is, what is the role of Jews in being critical of what they see around them happening in the Malchut? What they see happening at the civic level? What is the role already understood here by Jews in understanding that there's sometimes, even when it comes from the right authorities, so to speak, it's not right? And thinking about what that means in ways in which Shmuel never could have thought and never would have thought, but it raises the question. Now, everyone expects a nice tie-in to Hanukkah. First of all, my time is up. Second of all, if I'm going to be honest with you, Hanukkah is not an easy tie-in. Hanukkah is about Jewish autonomy in a Jewish land. We could say all nice things about how democracy and demos, and that's a Greek idea, and we imbibe it, and we remain. I don't want to do that because who said this morning, leave you unsettled? I want to leave you a little bit unsettled. I want to leave you with this question because I work at the Hartman Institute, and I can't leave you without this question, which is when we're thinking about civic responsibilities and duties in this country, how can that enhance our conversations with our brothers and sisters across the pond, who are also thinking about their civic responsibilities and their civic duties? And I leave you with all of those questions, and I hope that those questions continue to animate not only our thinking, but the way in which we bring texts to our students, texts that we're not looking for a one-to-one linear parallel. We are looking for the big ideas conversations that those texts open up. Thank you very much, and happy Hanukkah.